The cold was unbearable. Snowstorms roared outside the small shelter and the wind howled like a wild beast. Isara, the alien woman, shivered as she sat in the dark cave, holding her son, Lero, close to her. The warmth of his tiny body was the only comfort she had left. The little boy, no older than 5, was asleep, his small breaths shallow and weak. The cold had taken its toll on both of them, but Isara refused to let go. She couldn't. Not yet. She looked around the cave, her thoughts drifting to the ship that had crash-landed on this frozen, uninhabitable world. The wreckage was far behind them now, buried beneath snow and ice. There had been no way to send a distress signal, no way to contact anyone. Isara didn't even know how long they had been here. Time seemed to blur when you were on the brink of death, when the cold was a constant companion and the world felt like it was closing in on you. Lero stirred in her arms, his face pale and flushed with fever. She ran her hand through his soft, dark hair, whispering words of comfort she didn't even believe herself. "We'll be okay, my little one. I won't let anything happen to you." She tried to stay calm, but her body was shaking from the cold. She was out of options. The energy reserves in her suit were nearly depleted and there was no food left. Their only hope had been the ship's emergency survival gear, but it was all gone now. Even if help did come, it might be too late. Isara glanced at her son again. His eyes were closed, but she could see the pain in his expression, even in his sleep. She knew he was no longer fighting the cold. His tiny body was weak, unable to protect itself any longer. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry, not in front of Lero. He needed her strong, even if she didn't feel strong anymore. She pressed her face against his hair, trying to find warmth in him, to remind herself why she had fought so hard to protect him. Her species had once been a proud and powerful race, but now they were scattered, hunted to near extinction. Lero was the last of them, the last hope for her people. But Isara had failed him. She had failed her people. She had promised to keep him safe, and now they were both trapped here on a planet that had no mercy. The wind outside howled again, louder this time, shaking the walls of the cave. The snowflakes drifted in, swirling like tiny ghosts. Isara wrapped her arms tighter around Lero, as if that might stop the inevitable from coming. She wanted to believe that they would survive, that somehow someone would find them, but deep down she knew the truth. Her species had never been welcomed on other worlds. They were too different, too feared, too powerful for the peaceful races to accept. And now, even in the cold, dark silence of this planet, she could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on her chest. Her mind wandered back to the day they had fled from their homeworld, when the last of her people had been slaughtered by those who feared them. Isara had done everything she could to protect Lero, but it had never been enough. She had watched as their world crumbled, as the light of their civilization flickered out. And now she was about to lose him too. Isara's thoughts grew darker. There was no way out. The cold would claim them both. She didn't want to die here, but she couldn't help Lero if she couldn't save herself. She held him tighter, feeling his warmth fading. "Please, Lero, hang on," she whispered. "I promise I'll never leave you." She closed her eyes, exhaustion taking over her. The cold was becoming too much to bear. Her limbs were stiff, and her vision blurred. But just as she thought she might slip into the dark abyss of sleep, a faint noise broke through the silence, a crackling sound followed by the soft crunch of snow underfoot. At first, Isara thought it was just the wind, but the noise was different. It was too steady, too purposeful. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She shifted her position, straining her ears. The sound was growing louder. Someone was approaching. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't alone anymore. With all the strength she could muster, Isara forced herself to her feet, clutching Lero to her chest. Her body screamed in pain as she moved, but she didn't care. She had to see who was out there. It was their only chance. The cave entrance was dark, but she could now make out a shadow moving through the snowstorm. The figure was tall, heavy with gear, and moving steadily toward the Shelter. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Someone was really out there. Isara's pulse quickened. Could this be the help she had prayed for? Or was it another predator, looking for its next meal? As the figure came closer, Isara didn't wait any longer. She stepped forward, calling out weakly, "Help, please." The figure stepped closer, cutting through the storm with surprising ease. Isara's heart pounded in her chest. The cold had numbed her senses, but now, adrenaline sharpened her focus. She could see the outline of the figure clearly now, a tall human man, his face partially obscured by the wind and snow. He was carrying a large pack, his breath visible in the freezing air, but he wasn't slowing down. "Help. Please," Isara whispered again, her voice barely a croak. The words felt like they were coming from someone else, from a woman who had long since given up hope. But now, standing in the cave, watching this strange figure approach, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The human stopped at the entrance of the cave, his movements swift and purposeful. He looked around quickly, his eyes scanning the darkened interior. Then without a word he stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the small space, warmth cutting through the chill, though only slightly. The man looked down at Isara and Liro, his face hard but kind. He had dark hair, a rugged jawline, and eyes that betrayed the weariness of someone who had been through too many battles, too many losses. His clothing was practical, military style, with a few rips and tears from the storm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep and calm, though it held an edge of urgency. His eyes darted to the child in her arms, and he knelt down slowly, as if trying not to startle them. Isara didn't respond at first. Her head spun, her body weak, and the warmth from his presence felt surreal, almost too much to bear. Was she imagining this? Was this some strange twist of fate that would disappear as quickly as it had arrived? But the man didn't wait for an answer. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, portable heater. The warmth from the device hit her like a wave, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a shaky breath. She realized just how cold she had been, how much her body had been fighting to stay alive. "Here," he said, holding out a water canteen. "Drink. It's not much, but it will help." Isara hesitated for a moment before she took the canteen. Her hands were stiff, but she managed to take a small sip. The liquid was warm, and though it didn't feel like much, it seemed to awaken her senses in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm Isara," she said quietly, still unsure if she could trust this man. "This is Liro." Her voice cracked as she spoke his name, the weight of her journey pressing down on her once again. The human nodded, taking a seat on the ground near them. He didn't seem in a hurry, didn't make any sudden moves. It was as if he knew exactly how fragile they were, and he was giving them space to breathe, to recover. "I'm Jackson," he replied, his voice still calm, though there was something unspoken in his tone. "I wasn't sure I'd find anyone out here. Thought I was the only one." "Are you alone?" Isara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jackson hesitated, looking down at the ground for a moment, his face hardening. "Yeah, I am. I got separated from my group, but I'm still alive. That's all that matters." Isara could see the weariness in his eyes. He didn't have the look of someone who had come to save them. No. He had the look of someone who had been fighting for survival just as she had. He wasn't a hero. He was a man like any other, trying to make it through the same endless war that had torn apart her people. But even if he wasn't a hero, he was still here. And that meant something. It meant there was still hope. For a moment there was silence between them. The only sound was the crackling of the heater and the occasional gust of wind outside. Isara glanced at Liro, still curled up in her arms, his face flushed but sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She was holding him in her arms, but it was Jackson who had brought warmth into the cave, who had brought a chance at life back into the equation. "How did you find us?" Isara finally asked, her voice filled with curiosity. She couldn't help herself. This was the first time in days that she had encountered someone who wasn't trying to harm her or take her life. I've been out here for a while, Jackson explained, running a hand through his dark hair. Saw your wreckage from a distance. Thought I might find survivors. Izara's eyes widened slightly. You came from the wreckage? But how did you survive in this cold? I've been in worse situations, he said with a shrug. Just got lucky. And now you're lucky too. We'll get out of here. Izara glanced at the storm outside, its fury still raging against the planet. The thought of leaving this place seemed impossible. Yet here was this stranger saying they would escape. Could she trust him? Should she trust him? But something in his eyes told her that he meant what he said. And for the first time in days, Izara allowed herself to feel something more than dread. She allowed herself to hope. What now? She asked, her voice soft but determined. Jackson looked up, a faint smile crossing his lips. Now, we get you both to safety, one step at a time. Izara didn't know how or when, but she felt a small spark of hope grow within her. For the first time since the crash, she had someone on her side. And that, in itself, was a miracle. The fire crackled in the center of the cave, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Jackson sat on the cold ground, his back against a rock, looking down at the small alien family before him. Izara and Lero huddled together, wrapped in blankets he had found in his pack. The storm outside was relentless, but the warmth from the fire and the small heater had started to ease the chill that had settled deep into their bones. For a moment, there was peace. The only sounds were the howling wind outside, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, steady breathing of Lero, who had finally fallen into a deeper sleep. His tiny form, once shaking with the cold, now seemed at ease, his small face resting peacefully on his mother's shoulder. Izara looked at Jackson, studying him with careful eyes. She had never trusted humans before. Her people, the ones who had once been powerful and revered, had always been hunted by others. She had learned to be cautious, always looking over her shoulder, always expecting danger. But Jackson was different. He had found them, saved them, without any promise of reward. It was more than she could have hoped for in a place like this. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure how else to express what she felt, but the words were enough. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and a sense of wonder. Jackson glanced at her, then looked away as if uncomfortable with the attention. No need to thank me, he replied with a small shrug. I'm just doing what anyone would do. Besides, you're not out of the woods yet. Izara nodded. She knew the journey was far from over. They were still on a hostile, cold planet with no way of knowing when or if help would come. But Jackson's presence gave her a strange sense of security. For the first time in a long while, she felt like they weren't completely alone. Lero stirred in his sleep, and Izara gently shifted him, making sure he was warm and comfortable. She had never been a mother in this way. Her species didn't have the same deep connections to their children as humans did. But something about the way Lero had clung to her, how he had trusted her, had forced her to care in ways she hadn't thought possible. Jackson watched her for a moment, then looked down at his own hands, which were rough and calloused from years of hard work. He had seen countless people in his line of duty, had witnessed things that would have broken most others. But there was something different about Izara and her son, something that made him want to protect them, even if it meant risking his own life. You're not from around here, are you? Jackson asked after a long silence. His voice was softer now, more curious than before. Izara met his gaze. She had known this question was coming, but she had never expected to answer it. She had never told anyone her story. No one ever cared enough to ask. No, she replied simply. I'm from a distant world, a world that no longer exists. Jackson's brow furrowed, sensing there was more to the story than she was letting on. What happened? Izara looked away, her eyes clouding over with the memory of her people's destruction. It was a painful memory, one that she rarely allowed herself to revisit. But something about Jackson's quiet presence, his genuine Concern made her feel safe enough to share it. "We were a great people," she said slowly, her voice low. "We had the power to control the very forces of nature. We were once revered and respected by many worlds, but fear drove others to destroy us. One by one, my people were hunted down, and now I am the last one. Lero is the last hope of our kind." Jackson stayed silent, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had been trained to fight to survive, but hearing Isara's story made him realize just how much he didn't understand about the universe. There were civilizations out there like hers that had been destroyed because they were feared. It made him question everything he had been taught about right and wrong. "I'm sorry," Jackson said finally, his voice sincere. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Isara gave him a faint smile, though it was filled with sadness. "You don't have to. You've already done enough." Jackson shook his head. "I don't think you understand. Helping you was the least I could do. I didn't know your story, but I couldn't leave you out there, not like that." Isara didn't know what to say to that. She had never encountered someone like him. Most people saw her as a threat, something to be avoided or destroyed. But Jackson, he saw her as someone in need of help, a person, not a monster. She didn't know why, but the longer she sat with him, the more she felt like she was starting to believe it. Maybe humans weren't so bad after all. Maybe there was a way to trust again. For the rest of the night, they sat in silence, watching the fire burn low. Isara's mind wandered, but she kept coming back to one thought. Jackson had saved them. He had risked his own life for theirs. He was a stranger, yet he had done something no one else had. And in that moment, Isara realized something she hadn't known before. Not all humans were her enemies. Lero shifted in his sleep again, a small smile tugging at his lips as if even in his dreams, he felt safe. Isara placed a gentle kiss on his forehead and looked up at Jackson. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a bit more strength in her voice. "You've given us something we haven't had in a long time. Hope." Jackson met her gaze, his expression softening. "Hope's a powerful thing," he said, and for the first time in days, Isara allowed herself to believe that they might just make it out of this frozen hell after all. The morning came quietly, with the storm still howling outside the cave. The fire had died down to embers, and the warmth it had provided the night before had nearly faded away. Isara stirred in her sleep, the cold creeping back into her bones. She shivered but didn't wake immediately. Her mind was still heavy with the dreams that had visited her during the night. Dreams of her people, of her homeworld now lost to time. Lero was still curled up next to her, his small body nestled close to hers, and for a moment, she allowed herself to forget about the danger outside. But the peace didn't last long. A low growl echoed from the entrance of the cave, followed by the sound of something large moving through the snow. Isara's heart jumped. Her senses snapped to attention. She knew that sound. It was the unmistakable growl of a predator, one of the dangerous creatures that roamed the icy wilderness. Her body went rigid, and she instinctively pulled Lero closer, trying to shield him from whatever threat was outside. Jackson, who had been sitting against a rock, immediately sprang to his feet. He moved toward the entrance, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side. His face was set, grim, but there was something else in his eyes, something that told Isara he wasn't afraid. "Stay down," Jackson whispered to her, his voice low and controlled. "I'll handle this." Isara's pulse quickened. She didn't like the idea of Jackson facing danger alone, but she knew there was no time to argue. The growl from outside grew louder, followed by the sound of paws dragging through the snow. The creature was getting closer. Jackson crouched near the cave entrance, his eyes scanning the snowstorm, his hand resting on the blaster. He was ready for whatever came through. Isara's breath was shallow as she held Lero close, trying to keep him as quiet as possible. The last thing she wanted was for him to wake and see the terror in her eyes. Then, with a loud crash, the creature appeared. It was massive, its body covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to blend in with the snow. Its eyes glowed a fierce yellow, and its long claws dug into the ground as it stalked closer, its teeth bared in a vicious snarl. The creature had been drawn to the warmth of the cave, and now it seemed hungry for more than just warmth. Isara's heart raced. She had no idea what this creature was, but she knew it was dangerous. Jackson moved quickly, taking aim with his blaster. He fired, the blast ringing out in the cave, but the creature dodged with surprising speed, charging toward him with a terrifying roar. Jackson rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's snapping jaws. He quickly regained his footing and fired again, this time hitting the creature in the shoulder. The creature howled in pain, but it didn't retreat. It lunged at Jackson, knocking him to the ground. Isara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the struggle. Jackson was on the ground, struggling to hold the creature back with one hand while trying to draw his weapon with the other. His strength was fading, but he didn't give up. He gritted his teeth, pushing with everything he had to keep the creature at bay. Without thinking, Isara moved. She grabbed a large rock from the ground and threw it at the creature with all her strength. The rock struck it in the face, causing it to stumble back for just a moment. That was all Jackson needed. With a swift motion, he grabbed his blaster and fired one final shot, hitting the creature in the chest. It let out a final guttural roar before collapsing to the ground. The cave was silent for a moment, save for the sound of their heavy breathing. Jackson stood up slowly, his body covered in sweat and dirt. But his face was calm, his eyes scanning the dead creature. Isara's heart was still racing as she looked from Jackson to the fallen creature. She had never seen anything like it before. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jackson wiped his brow, glancing back at her. "I'm fine. Just a scratch or two. But this planet's got more surprises than I thought." Isara nodded slowly. She was still shaken by the attack. It had been close, too close. She felt the weight of their situation more than ever. They weren't just running from the cold. They were surrounded by creatures like that. Creatures that saw them as prey. Jackson moved toward the fallen creature, his eyes inspecting it carefully. "This thing's been hunting for a while," he said, crouching beside it. "It's not alone, there's probably more out there." Isara's stomach sank at the thought. "How do we survive if there's more of them?" "We fight," Jackson said simply. "I'll protect you. You and your son." He said it with such certainty, such determination, that Isara didn't doubt him for a second. But the truth was, she wasn't sure how much longer they could keep fighting. Her strength was fading, and Lero's condition was worsening. They needed help, and they needed it soon. "We need to leave," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "We need to find a place where we're safe." Jackson looked up at her, his expression softening. "I'll get you out of here, Isara, I promise. We just need to keep moving." But even as he spoke, the sound of more growls reached their ears. The storm outside had shifted, and it wasn't just the wind they were hearing. More creatures were out there, drawn to the warmth of the cave. Jackson stood up, his hand tightening around his blaster. He looked back at Isara and Lero, his expression grim. "Time to go. Get ready." Isara nodded, her heart pounding as she gathered Lero into her arms. Jackson moved toward the entrance, ready to face whatever came next. The fight was far from over. They had survived the night, but the cold was still out there, and so were the predators. The storm outside raged, howling like an angry beast. Jackson, standing in the cave's entrance, scanned the icy horizon, his eyes narrowing against the harsh winds. Every sense was on alert. The creatures were still out there. He could feel their presence. But they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They had to move. Turning back to Isara, he saw her carefully arranging her son Lero in her arms, her movements slow but steady. The child was still asleep, though his small body trembled slightly in her arms. Jackson's heart tightened. He had seen many things in his life, but there was something about this alien woman and her child that tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. "Isara," he said softly, moving toward her. We need to keep moving. We can't stay here too long. There are more of those things out there. Isara nodded, her face pale but determined. She had been quiet since the creature's attack, but Jackson could see the weight of the world in her eyes. She had known hardship, loss, and pain more than any person should ever endure. And yet, here she was, fighting for her son's life, for their survival. Jackson, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her words. There's something I need to tell you, something important. He looked at her, his expression softening. You don't have to tell me anything if you're not ready. I understand. Isara shook her head. No, I have to. You've already done so. Much for us. I owe you the truth. Jackson sat down next to her, his gaze never leaving her face. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm listening. For a moment, Isara hesitated. She looked down at Lero, her fingers brushing gently over his small head. She seemed to draw strength from him, a mother's instinct to protect her child shining through. I'm not like you, she began, her voice soft, almost as if speaking the words aloud made them more real. I'm not from this planet. I'm not even from this galaxy. My people, my species we're powerful. We controlled elements, we harnessed energy like nothing you could ever imagine. Jackson listened carefully, his brow furrowing. What do you mean, you controlled elements? Isara nodded. We could bend the forces of nature to our will. Fire, water, wind, earth. Our powers were a part of us. But it wasn't just about control. It was about understanding the world in ways no other species could. We were advanced, revered, and feared. She paused, her voice tightening as she continued. But that fear led to our downfall. Other races, they feared us, feared our power. So, they destroyed us. They hunted us down one by one, until I was the last one left. Lero is the last hope of my people. Jackson's eyes widened as he processed what she had just revealed. Your son, Lero, he's the last of your kind. Isara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Yes, he carries our bloodline, our hope. But our enemies are still out there. They won't stop until they find him and finish what they started. That's why I can't let anything happen to him. He's too important. Jackson felt a pang in his chest. He had always known war, loss, and destruction, but hearing Isara's story made him realize how much he took for granted. He had never had to fight for survival in the way she had. He had never had to protect something as precious as Lero. I had no idea, Jackson said quietly. I never imagined. Your people. Your world. It's all gone. Isara nodded, her eyes distant as she relived memories of her lost homeworld. It was beautiful, peaceful, until it wasn't. She turned her gaze back to him. And now? Now I'm running, hiding. I'm the last of my kind, and the universe is too big for one person to hide forever. Jackson sat in silence, letting her words sink in. He could feel the weight of her burden, the responsibility she carried not just for her son but for an entire species that had been erased from existence. Is there any way to fight back? Jackson asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Any way to stop them from finding you or Lero? Isara shook her head slowly. I don't know. We've been running for so long. But every world I go to, I fear it's only a matter of time before they catch up. My people were too powerful. There are many who still want to see us wiped out. Jackson's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what she had been through. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he knew one thing, for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her or Lero. Not if he could help it. We'll find a way, he said, his voice firm. We'll keep moving, keep looking for help. There has to be somewhere safe for you and Lero. Isara gave him a small, grateful smile, but the sadness in her eyes didn't fade. I appreciate your help, Jackson. But the truth is, I don't know if there's a safe place for us anymore. My people's enemies. They'll stop at nothing. They've hunted us to the edge of extinction. Jackson clenched his fists. He didn't have the answers, but he wasn't about to give up on them. Not now. I'll help you. You're not alone anymore. Izara's eyes softened, a look of quiet relief crossing her face. She didn't have to say anything more. Jackson's words, simple as they were, meant the world to her. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for survival. As they prepared to leave the cave and venture further into the storm, Jackson's resolve hardened. He didn't know what the future held, but he would protect Izara and Lero no matter the cost. They had already lost so much. He wouldn't let them lose each other. The storm outside had not let up. Snow continued to whip through the air in furious gusts, reducing visibility to nothing. Jackson led the way, his boots crunching in the thick snow, while Izara followed closely behind, carrying Lero in her arms. The child, though still weak, was now awake and clinging to his mother, his small eyes darting around as if sensing the danger that still lurked in the wilderness. Izara could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Every step they took felt like one more step toward uncertainty. She had no idea where they were going or if they would even make it through the storm, but there was something about Jackson's determination that gave her a sliver of hope. He had been steadfast in his promise to protect them, and for the first time in a long while, Izara began to believe that they might just make it out of this frozen hell. They had left the cave behind, knowing that it wouldn't be long before more predators came sniffing around. Jackson had insisted on moving quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Izara stayed close, keeping Lero safe in her arms, her mind whirling with thoughts of the past, of her fallen people, and of the future that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. As they trudged through the deep snow, Izara couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The cold was unbearable, and her energy was quickly draining. She had been running for so long, fighting for survival every day, and it felt like there was no end in sight. Jackson glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Izara didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at Lero. "Go." Jackson nodded and began his descent into the valley. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled even louder as it swept through the valley, but he moved with purpose, guiding Izara carefully behind him. The terrain was rough, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. But they pushed on. As they neared the settlement, the glow became brighter. It wasn't a huge city, but it was something. Perhaps an outpost or a small research station. There was a building surrounded by a low wall, with a few lights flickering inside. Jackson's pace quickened as they reached the entrance. The door to the building was shut tight, and there was no sign of anyone outside. Jackson glanced around, his eyes narrowing. He could sense something was off. It was too quiet, too still. "Stay close," he whispered to Izara, his hand reaching for his blaster. "I don't trust this place." Izara nodded, her heart racing. She wasn't sure who or what might be inside, but she had to trust Jackson. He had led them this far, and she had to believe he knew what he was doing. The door creaked open as Jackson pushed against it, revealing a dimly lit interior. The walls were lined with metal panels, and there were crates stacked haphazardly along one side of the room. It didn't look like much, but it was warm. The air was thick with the smell of stale food and equipment, but at least they weren't outside anymore. Jackson stepped inside cautiously, his blaster ready in case there was anyone, hostile or otherwise, inside. Izara followed closely, cradling Lero in her arms. They didn't have long to wait. As they moved deeper into the building, they heard a voice. A low, gravelly voice that echoed through the room. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice growled. Jackson froze, his hand tightening around his blaster. Isara's heart skipped, a beat as she looked around, searching for the source of the voice. She hadn't expected anyone to be here, and she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. The voice came again, closer this time. "I said you're not supposed to be here." A figure stepped out of the shadows, a man wearing a worn-out uniform and carrying a rifle. He looked like he hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. his eyes sunken, his face covered in stubble. Jackson didn't lower his blaster. "We need shelter," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just let us stay for a while." The man's eyes flicked to Izara and Liro, his expression shifting from suspicion to surprise. "What are you?" he muttered under his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Izara stepped forward, holding Liro even tighter in her arms. "We're just trying to survive," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up inside her. "We don't mean any harm. We just need a place to stay." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering between Jackson and Izara. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Finally, the man lowered his rifle slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you need to understand something. No one comes here by accident. You're not just running from the cold, are you?" The man lowered his rifle, but he still kept a close eye on Jackson and Izara. His eyes flickered between them, scanning them as if trying to understand who they were and what they wanted. There was an intensity to his gaze, a wariness that only came from living through hard times. "We're not here to cause trouble," Jackson said again, his tone steady but firm. He glanced at Izara, who was still holding Liro tightly, her arms wrapped protectively around him. She was tired, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She wasn't ready to trust this stranger, but she had no choice. They had nowhere else to go. The man sighed, lowering his rifle completely now, though he didn't take his eyes off them. "Fine, you can stay, but you need to understand something first. This place, this outpost, is part of a larger network. There are people out there looking for you more than you probably know, and the wrong people might find you here." Isara's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't wanted to admit it, but she knew the danger was still out there, lurking. The last thing she wanted was for Liro to fall into the hands of those who sought to destroy her people. She didn't know who this man was, but his words carried weight. "We'll be careful," Jackson said, his voice low. "But we can't survive out there much longer. We need food, shelter, and maybe some answers." The man grunted, rubbing his hand over his tired face. "Answers, huh?" He looked at them both again, as if deciding whether to trust them. Then, without another word, he turned and gestured for them to follow. "Come inside. I'll show you where you can rest, but don't expect any warm welcomes. The people here aren't used to strangers, and we've got our own problems to deal with." Izara and Jackson exchanged a glance. It wasn't much, but it was something. They had to take what they could get. They followed the man into a small room within the outpost, dimly lit by flickering lights overhead. The space was simple, utilitarian. A bed in the corner, a small table with a few chairs, and a metal stove that had long since gone cold. There were crates stacked in corners, tools scattered about, and the faint smell of stale air. The room felt abandoned, as if it hadn't seen much use in a long time. "You can rest here," the man said, pointing to the bed. "I'll see if I can get you something to eat, but no promises. It's slim pickings around here." Izara carefully laid Liro down on the bed, making sure he was comfortable. She wasn't sure if the child could sleep, but she hoped that the warmth of the room would give him some comfort. His fever had subsided a little, but he was still weak, his body fragile from days of exposure to the cold. Jackson sat on one of the chairs near the table, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the tension in the air, the suspicion that still hung heavy in the room. He understood it. They were strangers here, and trust had to be earned. The man didn't seem eager to engage in further conversation. He walked to a small shelf and began rummaging through it, pulling out a few dried packets of food and some water. "This is all we've got for now," he said, handing a packet of food to Jackson. "Eat while you can. It's not much, but it'll do for now." Jackson nodded his thanks and opened the packet, handing it to Izara. She accepted it with a quiet thanks and began feeding Liro, doing her best to make sure he ate, despite his tiredness. As they ate, the man watched them, silently. Jackson noticed the way his eyes lingered on Izara and Liro, as if he was waiting for something. But Jackson didn't press him. The man was clearly holding something back, and Jackson wasn't sure if it was something he needed to know yet. Finally, after a long pause, the man spoke again, his voice gruff but softer than before. "I didn't mean to scare you earlier, but you've got to understand we're all in danger out here. People from the outside don't just wander in here for no reason. If you've been running from something, well, you're not the first." Izara looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door as if to make sure no one else was listening. He leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "There's more going on out there than you realize. Your people aren't the only ones who've been hunted. There are others, races, species, who've been targeted by the same people who came after you." Jackson's ears perked up. "Who are these people?" The man shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "You don't want to know. Trust me. The less you know, the safer you'll be." Izara exchanged a look with Jackson. She didn't like the sound of this, but she couldn't press him for more. Not yet. They had to be careful. She needed to protect Lero, and for that, she needed information. But pushing too hard could make things worse. "We're just looking for a place to rest," Izara said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "We've been running for a long time. We need to be safe. Just for a little while." The man's eyes softened slightly and he gave a slow nod. "You'll have that here, but remember, no one's safe for long in this world. The best thing you can do is keep moving. Keep your head low." Jackson glanced at Izara. She nodded, understanding the message. Safety, even if temporary, was all they could hope for right now. But they couldn't stay here forever. They had to find a real solution, a way to escape the constant fear that clung to them. The man turned away, moving toward a small door in the corner of the room. "I've got a few things I need to check. You two stay here and keep quiet. If anyone comes looking for you, don't trust them. Not yet." With that, he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Izara and Jackson were alone now. They sat in silence, the weight of their situation settling over them. They had survived, for now, but the road ahead was still uncertain. "We'll keep moving," Jackson said finally, his voice resolute. "We'll find a way. I promise." Izara didn't reply immediately. She looked down at Lero, his small form asleep in the bed. He was her reason for everything. She would do whatever it took to keep him safe. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance.